Hello, and welcome to Fantasy Writing for Barbarians. I'm John Negroni. I'm a published fantasy author with over 10 years of experience as a professional writer and editor. And on Fantasy Writing for Barbarians, my goal here is to help you out with your fantasy writing, whether you're a beginner, a barbarian, something in between, something beyond that, whatever it is. Now, on this show, what I usually do is I read an advice prompt from a listener that I have not seen yet. It's been procured to me by our wonderful producer, Natalia Emmons. And at the end of the show, we'll take a look, or we'll send, of course, all of this stuff over to our fact checker, our other producer, Bridget Surdock, for any extra fact checking, clarifications, insights, because I will be responding off the cuff and I'm bound to make mistakes, or I'm bound to overlook things. You know how it is. Before we do get started today, I just want to say that if you haven't listened already or watched already, we did our first video episode. That's right, on the YouTube channel. I did my first on-camera version of the show. It's also on the podcast feed for all of you audio-only listeners, so be sure to check that out if you were curious what I look like. I don't know why you would be curious what I look like, but I know some of you are because you have messaged me as much. But that said, I do want to be super clear that we're not going to do video all the time. It's going to be special occasions, fun treats. And all that said, we are going to get back to our regular scheduled programming right now. Okay, so I'm going to open up today's fantasy prompt. And again, I have not seen this yet. Let's see what we got here. All right, so this is coming to us from the Fantasy Writers subreddit on reddit.com. Username Spenny Leekman. And they write, "What do I write while my characters are traveling?" Oh, wow. First thing that comes to my mind is Wheel of Time. I know we talk about Wheel of Time all the time on this show, but that and Song of Ice and Fire, those are the two big fantasies where I feel like we spend so much time on the road. So this should be pretty interesting. All right, so they write, "I'm a few thousand words into a story I'm trying to write, and a lot of it is going to be the two protagonists traveling from place to place. I am struggling to come up with interesting things to write about without being repetitive. I've done a bit of dialogue explaining the world they live in, as well as describing the environment around them. I've tried continuing dialogue, either more about the world or just general dialogue to show character, but it feels forced, and I don't really want that. I guess I could just skip ahead, but it will make the pacing feel off. Anyone experience this or got any tips?" Yes, so I'm going to start with something that I know I brought up on the show before. It bears repeating, and it's so important. You need to think of your novel as a collection of scenes. And every scene, not chapters, scenes. Scenes need to be like mini stories. So if you do too many of the same kind of set piece or moment, that's what makes it feel repetitive. What's going to make it feel repetitive is not, oh, it's two characters talking again, even though that probably will still be repetitive to some degree. But if it's feeling like the story is not advancing, and it's feeling like the scenes that you're writing aren't changing anything with the characters, that's what you have to constantly keep in mind. So when you have characters traveling on the road, there are a lot of different things you can do with that in order to write compelling scenes. And it goes beyond them describing the world around them, or having a philosophical conversation, or doing all of these other things that are convenient for the author, but are not page-turning quality for the reader. So what I mean is, it's the same kind of principle when we've talked about things like exposition and world building, and how if you don't do exposition correctly, it feels more like the exposition is serving the author more so than it is the reader, because what you're doing is you are just writing a bunch of stuff that is genuinely like people, how should I put this, that is kind of just making it easier for you to set something up, or something that's going to be revealed later, stuff like that. It's not really going to be something that the reader is going to have an emotional journey with. And oh yeah, emotional journey. That's another huge important concept. Now, if your characters are on a journey physically, geographically, you want the reader to be on an emotional journey with them. That is key. So as you're writing different scenes, you need to, of course, fashion them against what the reader should be feeling. So if you're traveling, if you're going from place to place, try to investigate the emotions that you want the reader to have. The characters should follow suit. So if you want the reader to feel like this is a grand adventure, like it's going to take forever to get to this place, you need to craft the scene as much. You need to make the characters feel that journey, feel the weight of it. And if you do that, if you accomplish that, then the next scene or the scenes a couple after that they need to do something different, right? They need to capture a different emotion that's part of the journey, because every step of the journey needs to have some kind of change, some kind of difference that is spurring the characters and advancing the story. I know we've talked so many times about using Michael Haig's 6-act story structure to outline your novel, and doing this with scenes is extremely helpful. And so you can refer to that episode for the full breakdown of it. But essentially what you want to consider is looking at your story as a collection of scenes within 6 acts. And each scene needs to be pushing the characters to different moments in time on that outline. So having the characters better understand themselves, grappling with their wounds, their traumas from their pasts, kind of just increasing like, okay, here's a moment of a lull. What can I do to shake things up, but to serve multiple functions? So what I mean is, if you just have a scene where characters are on horseback and they're trying to get to this inn, but they're lost, you want to try to accomplish 4 or 5 things, at least, which is maybe some tension and conflict between the two characters, advancing that aspect of the story. You want to maybe do some foreshadowing to an action scene later, some foreboding of like there's a shadow out of the corner of their eye, they're feeling tense, and they're worried that something is going to attack them. You want to maybe use some lush imagery and vivid visuals in order to kind of just paint the scene for the reader and make them feel like they're in there. So you see what I'm saying? It's like every scene needs to be doing lots of different things in order to keep the story feeling alive, urgent, and I got to keep reading to know what happens next. That's the key. So all that said, let's take a look at an example. I mean, again, Wheel of Time is a great example of this. Let's look at Eye of the World, because Eye of the World is so much traveling, right? And my favorite traveling moments, I shouldn't say favorite because I really do like a variety of them, but consider how Robert Jordan was able to balance so many different like combinations of characters. You had Matt and Rand kind of going from inn to inn, and then you had Perrin and Egwene also kind of like, you know, going through like the woods and having the run-in with the wolves. These are 2 different journeys. They're going to the same place. They are completely different emotional journeys, because what Jordan did was he used all these combinations of characters and the differences between what their journeys were like in order to paint what's unique about the characters themselves. So take a look at Perrin and Egwene's journey. So much of that involves, it's not just them rolling around through the woods, it's Perrin fighting back this power he's feeling, that this connection to the wolves, you know, running into a character who was really, really cool, and learning more about his connection to that. It involved Egwene and them meeting the Tinkers and having this whole kind of, you know, subplot of, you know, could we live a lifestyle like this, a life of pacifism? Is she going to embrace being this basically, you know, nice to die, a sorceress? And then contrast to that, you have Matt and Rand. And Matt and Rand's journey is way more hackneyed. I mean, it's way more visceral in the sense that they are barely scrapping by for food. It's more about them learning that they are still, like, this is how they're growing up. They're coming of age. They have to find food for themselves. They have to use the skills they learned from Tom in order to entertain people, like get people at inns for food. And then you have moments of them going through the countryside. You have moments of them going through more perilous situations, being on ships, trying to hide their identities. Yes, it is showing traveling, and it's getting across this idea of a grand epic adventure. It's hard to get to these different locations. And that was the point of what Jordan was trying to accomplish with Eye of the World. He grew up on Tolkien. He wanted to really illustrate how difficult it actually would be to be traveling, especially like on foot for a lot of this, for these characters. So he used these like long chapters of explaining how grueling it is for the characters in order for you, the reader, to feel like it's going to be worth it when we get to Tar Valon. And they don't even get to Tar Valon in that book, but still, it's just one of those things where you want the character, the traveling moments, to not just accomplish, like what I see all the time when I'm helping people with their books and editing is, it'll be a scene and it's only accomplishing 1 or 2 things. And you feel that the author was just like, oh, this is going to be a scene. I want them to have this conversation because later this is going to come up. And that's all the scene is doing. And the problem is that it feels flat if that's all the scene is doing, or it's all that the scene is doing with a lot of purpose and intention. You know, there might be some little things here and there, but it's not really feeling like you're like infusing the story with a lot of, you know, epic storytelling or layered kind of storytelling. So that's a really important factor to consider as well. For me, I don't love doing traveling scenes as much. My latest novel, it's been a while since I did any kind of novel with a lot of traveling scenes. What I usually do is I shortcut those things. And if I do have traveling, it's usually a montage. It's usually explained pretty quickly. It's usually a little bit like I usually just try to get to the good stuff. And it's like, okay, like a week has gone by. We maybe get a refresher of like, here's what's happened so far, but not that much has happened because the characters have been so focused on, getting something accomplished, getting something done. And I always want, in my books at least, I always want every chapter to feature something totally new in terms of the location and the feel and the mood and the atmosphere so that it feels like when you're reading this book and you're going from chapter to chapter, you're not feeling like you're going to be stuck in one place for too long. You're feeling like, oh, I got to read the next chapter. I wonder where we're going to go next. That was the mood that I wanted to send across in my book. That's not the only way to do it. There are tons of different ways you can do it that are all equally valid. It just depends on what you want to say with your story. But for what this person is asking, they're feeling worried about the pacing. You don't have to worry about the pacing if you are focused on the emotional journey. If you're focused on what the reader should be feeling and being extremely mindful of what kind of emotions you can evoke there. Do you want to make them laugh in this scene more than anything? Do you want the reader to kind of just feel like a longing of like, I can't wait till they get to this destination? That's what you need to investigate. That's what you need to focus on, right? And so, yeah, I would focus on that. And I would definitely try to, if you're feeling like something's kind of repetitive, you might want to consider time jumps. You might want to consider, maybe I don't, have an entire chapter devoted to just this thing on the road because we already did that. What's something I can do to mix things up? What's something I can do to subvert what's already happened in the novel? So, for example, if you take a look at Song of Ice and Fire, I forget which book it was, maybe it was Storm of Swords, the one where Arya is traveling with the Hound, right? There are a lot of moments where Arya and the Hound are basically like the Hound is her bodyguard, and the Hound will save her or attack these people who are evil or whatever, and stop the bandits or whatever. But then you have that whole scene. I think it might have just been in the show. I don't remember if it was in the books too, but there's the whole scene where they go to the house where they're staying with the guy and his daughter, and they're super selfless, right? They've been ravaged by war in the Riverlands, but they're willing to give what little food they have to Arya and the Hound. At the end of that scene, what ends up happening is the Hound steals from them. And Arya is super upset by this, right? And she's just kind of like, it's like such a subversion of like the Hound is this violent dude. And she just doesn't, like, she is starting to see the downsides of the lifestyle that she thought was so gallant, right? Of being a knight. I know the Hound isn't a knight, and that's part of the story, but the idea of her understanding there's such a thin line between strength and violence. And that is a subversion of an earlier scene that theoretically it's still two characters traveling, but you are working in different moments, different things that can happen on the road that teach the characters and put the characters through different emotional frameworks that are going to keep your reader intrigued and have your reader guessing, having them wonder, well, what's going to happen next? Because it feels like in this story, there's always something different, on the horizon. It's not just going to be repetitive stuff. It's not just going to be Arya and the Hound bickering on the road again. It's going to be Arya suddenly being a little bit more scared of the Hound, maybe because of what he's capable of and reckoning with aspects of him that she didn't consider before. So hopefully that explains or gives you an idea of how to strategize maybe moving forward. Let's take a look at some of the comments, though, to see what some other folks had to say. Igrazdil, I don't know how to say that correctly, sorry. They wrote, you have a few options. I would highly recommend ignoring the guy that said things like bandits, chapter-length adventures, and monsters. If your story is about traveling and the journey they take, then those are good ideas. I think they're referring to another comment we haven't seen. But in this case, it sounds like you have a story you're telling that simply requires lots of traveling. The likely best option for your story is simply to write a bit about how they traveled and then move on to the next scene with a break indicator. Essentially, skip the boring bits. If something needs to happen on the journey, you can just do the same thing. Open a new scene when the important bits start or are close. I don't know. I mean, I feel like this is kind of generic advice. It's just kind of like, yeah, that's probably what they had in mind already, but it's not really, you're not really getting to the heart of the issue, which is like, why are those bits boring? Right? And what can you do to make those bits less boring? And I think that's more of where the decision making needs to happen. But, you can still follow this advice and it might still work. It's just like this kind of edges on the just right advice, which is like, oh, just write and then figure out what you want to cut later. That might be kind of spinning your wheels a little bit too much and putting the original poster through kind of like a, I don't know, like maybe a slog of an experience or an exercise. They had a lot of back and forth in these comments. I don't really want to go through all of it, but I'll let them sort that out. Okay, so then Voltaire Need, we've seen this person before. They said, read Lord of the Rings, but also note that Tolkien often just goes, and then they pass 3 days in the rain without anything of note happening. I think that Lord of the Rings isn't the best reference point. I think that so many fantasy stories have already subverted Lord of the Rings in this way. Like I just said with Robert Jordan, I'd say that pay more attention. It doesn't have to be the newest stuff out there right now, but maybe stuff that's within the last 20, 30 years might be a little bit more useful. I would look at Black Tongue Thief does this pretty well because that has a lot of traveling. I would take a look, and then that's more recent actually. But if you want something that's, I've already mentioned Game of Thrones, of course, and Wheel of Time, but I would say Name of the Wind is pretty good about this, partly because that's also a story where it's a character talking to the reader so much. And also, I don't know, I would say that C.S. Freeman, actually, her Feast of Souls trilogy, I actually really like that one. I like that one because I think what she was able to do with the traveling in that was kind of have a mystery to it. And, a kind of like, when are the characters going to figure out what's really going on? And also there was like a kind of simmering potential romance underneath the surface. She made the traveling really interesting because you never knew when something was about to pop off. And so there's all kinds of strategies you can do. But yeah, again, Lord of the Rings, there are certain things that you can't really do to get away with that Tolkien was able to get away with 50, 60, 70 years ago, however long ago it was. All right, let's see here. YVH27 writes, I agree with Egrisdil here. That was the first comment. Or do one extended travel sequence showing how they travel, and the next instances of travel, you just describe the departure and the arrival and use the break indicator in between. I feel like that's too prescriptive of advice and not really, I don't know, I just feel like that's not really doing much. If for some reason the passing of time needs to be felt by your reader, you could consider implementing flashback scenes or chapters or another narrative device while on the road. Yeah, flashbacks can be good. I think that you have to make sure that you're doing the flashbacks really well, though. Flashbacks are a risk. And sometimes it's like a high risk, high reward. I like doing flashbacks, although I pulled the reins on one book I was doing that had a lot of flashbacks in it because I felt like the flashbacks weren't good enough in order to keep the reader interested. Sometimes, I know for me, I can be reading a novel and I feel like a flashback is coming like multiple times, like every few chapters. That can be really grating on the reader. Maybe if you do it one time, that's okay. But relying on it too much, it starts to make it feel like it's a dual timeline novel, which is fine, but dual timeline is really tricky to pull off in fantasy because it genuinely, like, it tends to conflict with the purpose of the fantasy novel or the thing that the reader is trying to get out of the fantasy novel versus a more contemporary literary kind of book where dual timeline is more common. So if you don't know what dual timeline is, essentially it's when you have in a book two different POV characters at least, who, like, one is maybe in the past, one is in the present, or you could have another one that's in the future, and you're kind of going back and forth, and the point of the novel is sort of illustrating, for example, like a mother and a daughter. You're kind of seeing the mother's story in the 1950s, the daughter's story in the 1980s, stuff like that. And again, it's something that you typically see more so in contemporary fiction, literary fiction, that sort of thing for multiple reasons. But yes, I'd say that maybe consider flashbacks, but I would say if you're going to do one, you really got to get it right. The flashback has to be really good. It has to be a really tight scene. It has to feel like a good story. It's the same kind of principle as prologues. If you don't do the prologue well, it can feel like a slog. It can feel like the reader is not getting anything out of it or that it's not progressing anything. That's the issue. And if the only thing you're getting out of a flashback is lore, exposition, and revelation stuff, that's not enough. It's not enough. It needs to do more. It needs to make you feel something. It needs to make you not just illuminate something for the character or kind of like get across a wound or whatever. It needs to kind of make things feel like, wow, like stuff's getting real. I'm trying to think of a good example because when you think about it, a lot of novels don't really rely on flashbacks. I mean, that's something I like about A Song of Ice and Fire. Martin doesn't use flashbacks. He uses what characters say, about the past. And a lot of the time he uses unreliable narrators. So characters will be talking about past things. And yeah, it's kind of told in that way. I'd say that if you're going to do a flashback, maybe it needs to be a little bit more original. I like how Stardust Thief does it, where a lot of the flashbacks are actually stories that one of the characters is telling, in a very part of that character's deal is that he is a storyteller. He loves stories. And so he tells this epic tale or whatever. Name of the Wind, again, would be another example of this, where it's less about this omniscient sort of here's what happened in the past matter of factly, and it's more so like, a character sort of like talking about something that a lot of people understand, and then that can make it interesting because then the reader can get a sense of how history works in a world. And that's getting a little bit, that's creating more intrigue. That's creating a little bit more of like, wow, this world is kind of interesting because of this, and this. All right, so I think that should about cover it. There are definitely a few more comments, but I think I've gotten across my point of view. And of course, we'll always link to the prompt if you want to see some of the comments as well and see if you agree or disagree with anything I say or they say. But for now, I'm going to turn it over to our fact checker, producer Bridget Surdock, to see if I got anything wrong or anything needs some extra clarification. So don't go away. We're going to be right back. And we're back. All right, friends. So I just got Bridget Surdock's notes here. Producer Bridget, listen to the audio we've done so far. Let's see what they had to say in terms of, let's see if we got some fact checking here, anything that needs to be fixed. So Bridget writes, I believe the scene with the hound stealing from the folks in the Riverlands was only in the show. Did a quick look on a few different wikis, and it appears it wasn't in the books. Okay, yeah, I had a suspicion that was the case because as I was saying, I was like, I feel like I only saw this. I don't remember reading it. So thank you, Bridget, for clarifying that. So those of you who maybe have read Song of Ice and Fire don't feel gaslit right now. Like, wait a second, that didn't happen in the books. So there we go, cleared up. Bridget also wrote, Lord of the Rings was published 70 years ago, almost to the date. Fellowship was in 1954, Two Towers in 1955, and Return of the King in 1956. Yeah, thanks. I couldn't quite remember, because I always remember the animated movie was in the 70s, and I know that Tolkien wrote it after World War II, so I couldn't remember, like, oh, is it the late 40s, 50s, 60s? It was a big blur to me for sure. I wasn't around, as it turns out, back then. I wasn't quite born yet, even though I know that won't be a shock to a lot of you because I sound a lot younger than I actually am. But, and Bridget wrote The Hobbit was published even earlier in 1937. So that's almost 90 years old. Yeah, that's wild to think. I actually didn't realize Hobbit was that far or that long beforehand. That's interesting. So yeah, I know there was like a whole movie about Tolkien. I think Eddie Redmayne played him. I want to say I never saw that movie though. So that would probably help me out in terms of contextualizing some of this stuff timing wise. Bridget said, okay, so I went back to re-listen to the prompt as I'm wont to do to make sure I was understanding what exactly OP was looking for help with. For a second, I thought they said that the act of travel itself was integral to the plot, but it seems more like a byproduct of it. So first thing I think they should figure out is how important the travel aspect of the novel really is. If they're struggling to figure out how to write it, I'm going to assume not very. Yeah, I think that was my takeaway as well. It seemed like they were treating the travel stuff as not scenes. They were treating it as filler. They were treating it as, here are the things that happen in between the cool stuff. And it's a very common trap that writers can run into where they feel like they have to write everything. Like I did this back with one of my first fantasy novels, and I remember going back, editing and revising and being like, you know what, I could just take this out. I don't need this whole scene of where they're walking to the building. We can just cut right to the building, and that is great. We have cut to the good part. And that doesn't mean travel scenes don't sometimes have smart functions, as we've already kind of discussed here. It just means that you have to be very particular about the cadence of scenes. People relate to this criticism to pacing, but it's not just pacing, it's also variety, right? If you have the same kind of traveling scene over and over again, you have to make sure it's doing something unique every single time. That's a tall order. So if you feel like you're running into that with your book, that might be a sign that you haven't really outlined it in a way that is intentional and is getting across what you really want to say with your story. And then it's also inflating your word count. It's a lose-lose for sure. Bridget said, you've already given excellent advice as always. Thanks, Bridget. With thinking of it as scenes rather than travel between scenes. Oh, cool. Yeah. So exactly what I just said. If the travel is not a scene, if it's just getting from one scene to the next, you don't need to give it that much time. Simple way to solve this is, of course, summarizing. Smash cuts exist too and are totally normal. I do think that with smash cuts, yeah, I use those depending on the novel in terms of like ending like a little bit of a section of a chapter and end scene so that we can begin the next scene and it cuts the next thing. I do think that this is something that I go back and forth on when it's effective and when it's not, because sometimes it can be a little bit jarring to suddenly skip a bunch of things, be like, that happened kind of quickly. Sometimes you can get away with this. I think somebody had mentioned in the comments already, but like switching POV and doing like a POV chapter or a flashback or something to break things up. And that can help. It can make it feel like for the reader, time has passed in the real world so that it's more believable that. So what I mean is like let's go to A Song of Ice and Fire. If we had the chapter where they're on the King's Road, they're still like super far up in the north, and Ned Stark, is scolding Arya for doing her business and being mean to her sister. And then we have a section break, and then the next thing we're in King's Landing, and all of a sudden Ned is confronting the whole small council. You'd be like, whoa, whoa, whoa. That's a lot of time you just jumped to. It would feel like the pacing is off. It would feel like the cadence of things it's like rushed. Hold on, like clearly there had to be. So yeah, summarizing can help here. And it really is a tricky thing sometimes to make sure you get that stuff right, because your gut instinct is going to help you a lot. But this is also something that beta readers can help with, because they're not as close to the writing, and they can pick up on when the pacing feels off for them. And you can do what you can to either take their advice or adjust a little bit on their advice, whatever you need to do. Bridget said, or you could make the distance between places smaller. If it's not supposed to feel like some grand adventure and this long slog from point A to point B, just shorten the distance. Yeah, I mean, that's always pretty valid. I think that, yeah, it's like not everything has to be Wheel of Time, in which the long distance is part of the story and it's a big deal. Poppy War was kind of like this. Poppy War definitely, you could feel that there were like long distances between things, but usually there were places that break up the travel scenes, or we would just kind of go to a place because nothing eventful happened, and that's good to do as well. Bridget wrote, or give them a quicker mode of transportation. Maybe instead of on foot, they have horses or some fantasy creature, or instead of that, they have a cart, or maybe they even have trains. Yeah, in terms of Wheel of Time, there were scenes where sometimes they travel by boat, and it's just a lot faster, and then all we have to get out of that scene is, and Rand and Matt learned how to play the fiddle with Tom, and it was very fun, and they made some money, and you could do that in a page. And you can feel like stuff happened, it was interesting, but you don't have to go into granular detail, and the next thing you know, you're in the next location. There you go. If that's not where your scenes are, if that's not the point of the novel, don't direct the reader there just because you feel like the pacing will be off. But if that is important, you need to examine why. Why do you want the travel to be emphasized? What are you trying to say with that? And if you work backwards from there, the rest should fall into place. Yeah, and in terms of Lord of the Rings, the travel is part of the story in that as well, because you're trying to get across how far away they are from the Shire. But think about how every time they're on foot or doing something, they're in a different location. They're somewhere that is different from anywhere they've been before. There's character drama going on. There's intrigue. There's always something else happening to fill all the blanks. And as I've said many times, you're infusing these scenes with more functions than just, oh, maybe we'll have a conversation, we'll get across a little bit of characterization, a small bit of world building. No, you want to get across 5 or 6 things in a scene. So you feel like the reader can actually feel like they're getting a lot of things out of the scene and picking up on a lot of things that are being set up to be paid off later. But all right, that is everything that Bridget said on this particular conversation. So hopefully this was helpful, as I usually say. I think that, yeah, travel stuff, it's very integral to fantasy for sure. And sometimes you're not going to do a perfect job of it. Sometimes you're going to write it and it will feel maybe like it's a bit rushed or you have a missed opportunity, but that's what revisions are for. And if you're outlining your novel effectively, not just chapter by chapter, but of course, doing it by this exact story structure or something similar to that, in which you are paying close attention to the character arcs and the various set pieces that advance the novel and how all those things intersect. If you're doing your job there, then hopefully this won't be as much of a slog for you when you're actually in the drafting process. But all right, thank you so much for listening to Fantasy Writing for Barbarians. We're going to be back soon. We have some cool new episodes lined up, some fun stuff we have scheduled. And as always, if you have your own advice prompt you would like to send into the show, if you have a question for me, of course, you can email us anytime, fantasywritingforbarbarians@gmail.com. You can also join the Discord where we publish our new episodes and you can chat with us directly. And yeah, thank you so much. And if you haven't already, don't forget, you could always rate us on Apple Podcasts or Spotify if you like us enough. If not, let us know what we can do to do better. All right, take care, everyone, and be sure to keep on writing if that's what you feel like doing.